Okay, so now let's talk about eukaryotic cells. So there's two main types. There's plant cells and there's animal cells. And once again, one main difference between eukaryotic cells and prokaryotic cells is that eukaryotic cells have a nucleus and they also have many organelles. And those organelles have different functions. And so we're going to be talking about the organelles and the function of those organelles next. Okay, so the first organelle that we're going to be talking about is the nucleus. So the nucleus, it's also a double layer, so it's a double layer of fat, and it's also semi-permeable. So things go inside the nucleus, and some things cannot go inside the nucleus. And the reason why the nucleus has a double membrane is because it has the most important part of the cell. It has the DNA. Okay, so the DNA it's the most important part of the cell, if you will. And if you destroy the DNA, you also destroy the cell. And the reason why I say that the DNA is the most important part of the cell is because the DNA essentially determines a lot of characteristics about you. So, for example, it determines your looks. It also determines your health, whether you're healthy or not, and it determines basically the types of proteins that we're going to be producing, and so on and so forth. And this is why it has to be protected, and it's protected by a double layer of fat, if you will. So the nucleus, the main function of the nucleus is actually to protect the DNA. Okay, so the next organelle that we're going to be talking about is the endoplasmic reticulum, or ER. So this is where proteins and lipids or fats are synthesized. So there are two endoplasmic reticulum, rough ER and a smooth ER. So what's the difference between the rough ER and the smooth ER? So the rough endoplasmic reticulum, or rough ER, it has a bunch of ribosomes. And because it has a bunch of ribosomes, then the function of the rough endoplasmic reticulum is actually to synthesize proteins. So the proteins that are going to be basically targeted to the cell membrane. If it doesn't have ribosomes, then we call that smooth ER. It's called smooth ER because it doesn't have ribosomes. And the purpose of the smooth ER is actually to synthesize the lipids or fats. Okay, so now we're going to be talking about another organelle. So the Golgi apparatus. So the function of the Golgi apparatus is actually to package and transfer the proteins that are made or that are synthesized in the rough endoplasmic reticulum. Again, those proteins that are going to be targeted to the plasma membrane or cell membrane. Okay, so the nucleus, the endoplasmic reticulum, and the Golgi apparatus work together in order to produce and transport proteins to its proper destination. In this case, the cell membrane. So an example that I tell my student is that these three organelles function similar to like the post office. So whenever you want to send a letter to someone, in the letter you must put an address and you must put a stamp, and then you take it to the post office, and then the mailman is going to ensure that that letter is going to arrive to its proper destination. So kind of like the nucleus, the plasma reticulum, and the Golgi apparatus. All of those ensure that the proteins are synthesized and then they're going to arrive to its proper destination. Okay, so now we're going to be talking about one of my favorite organelles, the mitochondria. So the mitochondria is known as the power plant or powerhouse of the cell. So the function of the mitochondria is to make energy for the cell. So the energy that the cell uses is actually made or synthesized in the mitochondria by the process of cellular respiration, and we'll talk about this process in a later chapter. One important fact about the mitochondria is that it doesn't matter if you're a male or a female, the mitochondria that is found inside your body was given to you by your mom. And they basically use the mitochondria in order to determine the maternal side of your family. Again, the main function of the mitochondria is to produce energy. And another important thing about the mitochondria is that it actually produces its own proteins. A lot of proteins are actually synthesized in the mitochondria. All right. So plants, in addition to having a mitochondria, they also have another very interesting organelle, the chloroplast. So the chloroplast works similar to the solar panels that we use. So what's the function of the solar panels? So the solar panels basically what they use, they capture the energy or the rays of the sun, right, in order to transform it into usable energy that we use in our house to power, let's say, for example, light bulb or other things as well. So the chloroplast is basically doing the same function. It's trapping or capturing the energy from the sun and it's using it in order to make its own energy. So essentially, the chloroplast is important for photosynthesis. And we'll talk about that on a later chapter. Alright, so now let's talk about lysosomes. So lysosomes is basically full of enzymes, full of proteins. And the purpose of these proteins is to kill invaders, just to kill foreign invaders, proteins or particles that shouldn't be in your cells. And they're also important to actually break down cells that have been compromised, cells that have been infected with the virus. So lysosomes, lyso means essentially to kill, if you will. So the function of the lysosomes is to kill foreign invaders. Alright, so now let's talk about the cytoskeleton. The cytoskeleton gives the cell a structure or shape. When you hear the term skeleton, what does it sound to you? It sounds kind of like the bones in your body, right? So the bones in your body are giving your body shape and structure. Imagine if you didn't have any bones. You will be just like a blob of skin. It's not very nice, right? So again, the function of the cytoskeleton is to give the cell a structure. And in diseases such as, for example, Alzheimer's disease, basically what happens is that the cytoskeleton is no longer working properly. And essentially what's happening to the cell is that the cell is dying. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about the endosymbiotic theory. What the endosymbiotic theory states is that the mitochondria and the chloroplast were actually ancient bacteria. And then a eukaryotic cell basically engulfed the mitochondria, and instead of eating it, what happens is that it made it part of the cell itself. And the reason for that is because that eukaryotic cell was actually benefiting from that bacteria. And instead of killing it, it made it part of the cell itself. And if you look at, for example, the mitochondria and the chloroplast, both of them, they actually have their own DNA, and both of them can actually make their own proteins. And also, when you look at the actual size of it, it looks fairly similar to the size of bacteria as well.